We have a presentation and discussion of potential council action and revenue options. So I'll turn this over to our city manager and Eric Christensen, our finance director.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Council. While Eric and Matt prepare themselves to present material to Council for consideration, I would like to just introduce the topic. Again, we would like to just reintroduce to you the topic that has been part of an ongoing discussion in Burien for many years, the topic of expenditures versus revenues. Council took action on this topic approximately 4 years ago under the guidance of then City Manager Burien Wilson. The steps taken during that time by Council and Mr. Wilson were part of a multi-step process meant to improve the overall financial standing of Burien. As we all know, small changes over a prolonged period of time are easier to make and have less of an immediate negative effect. Small changes that commenced 4 years ago improved the financial position of the city and even contributed to a positive increase in Burien's credit rating, which is a challenging goal for any council and city manager to achieve. So thanks to that council and City Manager Wilson. We are now at the next steps in the process. The potential next steps being discussed tonight are projected to keep us at level spending for at or close to the coming decade. Earlier this year, city personnel commenced a 5-month-long briefing with council on the limited ways in which the city can raise revenue and of 3 potential sources for additional revenues in Burien. The reason for presenting this information to council over a period of several months was to ensure ample amount of time to consider the city's current financial situation, the limited avenues available to a city for raising revenue, services and programs currently offered by the city, and the potential effects to existing programs and services over time if revenues are not increased. Tonight you will hear again from Eric Christensen, Finance Director, and Matt Hobson, Program Manager for FCS, the city's financial consultant. They will summarize all of the information shared with you throughout the year and help to answer questions. As a reminder, the city can perform all necessary work and provide all necessary services only if it has sufficient revenue. Please keep in mind the following cautionary tale when asking questions of Eric and Matt and deliberating this topic. King County government is currently preparing to endure a major financial challenge in 2024 due to a lack of funding. It is projected that the county will eliminate upwards of 60 positions or jobs next year, which will undoubtedly have a detrimental effect on delivery of services. Public health services are also being affected as the county is projected to close most of its public health clinics. These are all the types of actions that occur when there is insufficient funding to pay for services. Thank you, Mayor and Council, for your attention, and I now hand it off to Eric and Matt.
Thank you, City Manager Bailon, Mayor, and the Council. Eric Christensen, Finance Director. The purpose of this agenda item is to provide a summary presentation regarding potential council action revenue options to address the general fund's forecasted revenue gap. The revenue options consist of community development permit fees, an increase in water and sewer utility taxes, and an increase in the business and occupation tax. As a potential next step, the council may provide direction to staff to return later with legislation to implement the council action revenue options. At this time, I'd like to hand off the presentation to Matt Hobson, who will walk us through the council revenue action items.
Great. Good evening. Again, Mayor and Council, for the record, my name is Matt Hobson. I'm a project manager with FCS Group. We're a local consulting firm based out of Redmond, Washington, and we specialize in providing financial consulting services to local and state governments. Our firm has been working with the city, as Adolfo mentioned, to evaluate long-term revenue options for the city's general fund. Over the past several months, I've presented each of these options, and Eric kind of highlighted those 3 main buckets. Now, these revenue options, I want to outline that these are revenue options that only require city council approval. There are other revenue options that are available to the city, but they also require voter approval. We did talk a bit about those back in March 2023, so it's been a while. But a focus over the last several months is focused on those city council options to increase revenue. I do want to point out that these are not the only revenue options that council can adjust. they just tend to be the ones that move the needle the most. And they're generally more stable over time as reliable funding sources for city services. All right, next slide, please. So for the agenda tonight, I already covered a deeper dive for each of these options in previous council meetings. And as Eric mentioned, I'll be providing just a high-level flyover of those options and recapping with some observations at the end. Next slide. So back in March, we presented a 10-year financial forecast for the city's general fund. That forecast provided an outlook of the city's services, assuming current service levels and some assumptions about cost inflation. We then compared the expense forecast with an outlook of general fund revenues based on current tax rates and assumptions on property values, retail sales activity, and other economic factors. And it was, as part of that forecast, we identified a structural deficiency in the outlook of the general fund. Largely due to state property tax law, the city's revenue forecast simply cannot keep pace with the effects of cost inflation on existing services. This structural deficit is a challenge that many cities must manage in Washington state. So to respond to this financial challenge, we outlined two types of revenue options for the city to consider: those that require voter approval and those which require city council approval. And over the past several months, we focused on that second bucket, those city council revenue options. The options that we presented over the last several months, and which I'll highlight tonight, they would be able to manage this projected financial deficit that we project for the existing services of the general fund. Any additional services, or if you improve existing services, they would likely require other revenue options. For example, leveraging those voter-approved options. Next slide. The key three revenue options that we outlined, and they're ranked from lowest to highest revenue potential, is increasing certain building and planning permit fees with an impact in 2025 of about $120,000. Increasing the tax rate on water and sewer utilities that conduct business within city limits from the current 8% to 10%, which would generate about $400,000 per year beginning in 2025. And then I do want to point out, just because of the orders of magnitude for that third option, increasing the business and occupation tax rate from 0.1% to 0.2% would generate about $1.7 million. Now, the target overall funding we're looking for is around that $2.2 million. You can see that the B&O tax impact is by far the lion's share. To be frank, you can't close the gap of that 2.2 million without something, that impactful. Next slide. The graph here just outlines and summarizes the financial forecast we developed back in March. The blue bars represent our expense forecast over the next 10 years. The solid black line that runs horizontally across the chart, that's the revenue forecast without these revenue options. And so every time that black line is below those bars, that means we're running in a deficit and we are relying on reserves to save the day. Challenge with that is eventually you run out of money. And so the three revenue options that we're proposing are outlined in that dotted black line that runs horizontally across the chart. Generally speaking, you can see that if the city approved these three revenue options, all three of them, that it would be able to manage the cost of existing services, assuming general cost inflation. Next slide. Just a couple slides for each option. So the permit fees, these are targeting building and planning permit fees, which would generate about $120,000 per year beginning in 2025. These focus on several planning and building fees, and the goal is to better align these fees with the cost to provide service. The city's existing fees for these services on the table you see on this slide, they are currently below the cost to provide these services. And what that means, and it's important to recognize that it doesn't mean that these costs aren't being incurred. What it means is that these services are being subsidized by other revenue sources. And And so some of the key ones we'll point out there, I think there are, I can do quick counting on the slide here, 10 total fees being adjusted. And I want to point out that there's 3 sets of numbers on this slide. The first column, which says existing fee, that's the fee that's currently being assessed for these permits. The 2019 proposed fee column is the results when FCS Group conducted a fee study back in 2019. The last column is we've gone back and updated that cost of service and proposed fee based on inflation over the last 4 years. And that's the purpose of that third column. Next slide. We did think it was important just to recognize this idea of, we're charging permit fees to developers and to residents, that it is sometimes a helpful number looking at the market rate or what other cities are charging for that service. In this case, these are 4 of those fees that are up for consideration. The gold bar in each chart represents the city's current fee. The gray bar represents the proposed fee. And you'll see the fees that are assessed for similar services in some neighboring cities. In each of these cases, the city's existing fee is lower and in some cases significantly lower than what other cities are assessing for the same service. And the adjustments being proposed are designed to move the existing fee more towards what it costs to provide the service. Next slide. Speak to the second revenue option now, which is adjusting the city's water and sewer utility tax. This is a tax that's assessed on utilities that conduct business within the city of Burien. The utility taxes are one of the key revenue sources for not just the city of Burien, but for most local governments in Washington state. Across the state, these types of taxes comprise about 14% of all general fund revenue, third to property taxes and sales taxes. I think I mentioned this earlier, that utility taxes are often called the third leg of a 3-legged stool here in Washington state when it comes to revenue for local government general funds. Next slide. So the option being considered as part of this evaluation would be to increase the tax rate for water and sewer utilities from 8% to 10%. By comparison, most cities that have utility taxes for these types of utilities assess a tax rate of about 6%. Now, state law does not limit the rate by which local governments can assess this rate. And we did identify some cities in the state that assess a rate much higher than 10%. Increasing the tax rate to 10% is expected to generate about $400,000 in additional revenue each year, beginning in 2025. And the higher tax rate, if you assess that, would likely be passed on to water and sewer customers of these utilities. A planning level estimate for this impact, we estimate about $2 per monthly bill for residential customer. This is a preliminary estimate because there's several utilities that do business in the city, and it's really their prerogative to decide how they pass that tax on to their customers. So it is a high level estimate, and I wouldn't hold myself against what the bill ends up being. So I want to put that out there. Next slide. Last one, the third revenue option, which generates the most revenue of the 3 that we evaluated, is increasing the city's business and occupation tax rate. We reviewed this option back in October, and these taxes are assessed on gross receipts or on gross income of businesses. Businesses are classified into one of 4 categories, and the city can set unique tax rates for each of those categories, such as retail or wholesale. But you can't, but all businesses have to be assessed that same tax rate if they fall into one of those categories. Now, in 2002, the city adopted its first B&O tax rate of 0.05%. In 2015, the city voted to increase it to 0.1%, effectively doubling it. And then the option for consideration would increase it from the current 0.1% to 0.2%. The graph on the slide here just shows the historical revenue. You see the bump in 2015 in revenue, and that is simply due to the increase in the tax rate. Over the last 5 or 6 years, the city has been hovering about 1.6, 1.7 million per year from this tax source. Next slide. So compared to all the other revenue options we evaluated, this option would generate the lion's share of new revenue at $1.7 million beginning in 2025. We estimate the tax impact of about $1,000 to a business with $1 million in gross receipts. Now, businesses who report less than $200,000 in gross receipts statewide, or less than $20,000 in gross receipts just within Burien would be exempt based on current law from this tax rate, from the current tax rate and from any increase to that rate. Next slide. Just as a summary then, the three revenue options that we evaluated over the last year have a total combined impact of about $2.2 million in new revenue beginning in 2025, with the lion's share of that revenue coming from the increase to the local B&O tax rate. Next slide and final slide. So before I respond to any questions, I did want to point out again that these are our revenue options, and if they are approved by council, we project that they would generate sufficient revenue to effectively balance the budget of existing services over the next 10 years. They would likely fall short of funding any new services or expanding existing services. And these are not the only revenue options that City Council can adjust has the authority to adjust. They're just the ones that would effectively move the needle the most. They're stable revenue sources. And then should the City Council elect not to adopt these increases or to adopt a subset of these revenue options, we estimate that staff would likely need to find expenditure reductions at a similar level. And these expenditure reductions would have to be recurring in nature. They could not be one time because these revenue options are not one time. Combined, these revenue options would be equivalent to about 6% of your current budget in 2024. So if you're thinking if we don't adopt these rate increases, the equivalent expenditure reduction would be about 6% of what you spend in 2024. With that, I will wrap up my comments and I'm available to answer any questions.
Deputy Mayor Schilling.
Thank you for coming back and presenting this to us. I think it's important to have both options on the table for council-approved revenue options as well as voter-approved revenue options. So having both before us to discuss and to vote on, as well as approving for the voters to decide on, because I've the public safety levy, but there's also the Parks District. And I think that giving the community options for themselves is important too, to generate revenue. So I'll make a motion to direct staff to return later with legislation to implement both council action revenue options as well as voter approved revenue options.
Second.
Can we get that on the screen, please? Would you like to speak to your motion as there?
I just think this is important to have both options in front of us. We've discussed the public safety levy before multiple times, and we discussed the parks levy a little bit, but not too much. I think that would be a little bit different. But certainly, I think that there needs to be the mix to give the city all that it needs to not only be financially viable, but to reduce the deficit as well as grow revenues to fill in more of the reserves. So to direct staff to return later with legislation implement, as well as voter approved revenue options. Yes, that's my motion.
Any discussion or questions? Councilmember Sarah.
I just had a question which may be for Deputy Mayor Schilling versus for staff. I'm not sure whether the intention was for them to come back at both of those things at the same time, or whether it would be presented in a rolling basis.
Yeah, my intention is for them to come at the same time so that we can vote on what we need to vote on, both councilmatically as well as putting levies on the ballot.
Okay. Other questions? Councilmember Moore.
I seconded the motion, realizing the intention was to have both discussed at once. I
personally think that's a lot to try and wrap into one agenda item. Because while we have had quite a bit of discussion and conversation about these council action options, the voter approved options is something that I think we have a lot more information that should be brought up. And those are two different things. I agree that we should have both in front of us for consideration. I think personally that we, as a city, need both to be enacted. I think council needs to approve these options that have been presented and to encourage the public to vote for any options that they may be able to take advantage of to raise more revenue. This is something that could allow us to break even, but we know that our city deserves more funding for a variety of services. We have roads that are in desperate need of repair. We have parks that are also in desperate need of repair. We have people constantly calling for more police services. You know, someday we might even get a public works building and start saving funding that we're losing by not having one. There are a lot of things this city needs, and just breaking even, in my mind, is not sufficient. It is stagnation, and our city should strive for improvement and growth, not just barely hanging on, barely, you know, sliding by. So I think that these options are all necessary. I mean, we've been told that pretty clearly that they are necessary, unless we want to try and piecemeal something together that is the equivalent of 6% of our budget. That's pretty difficult. And I think the people who have put the time and effort into putting this plan of action together probably know pretty well what the best options would be for us to do that. So I'm going to support the motion, but I would add the caveat that I do think the council should vote for these options and have the voter approved options in a second discussion with more information. And the city should take both because we need it, our people need it. We should always want to do better, not just maintain. Thank you.
I have a question. So the King County cuts that was mentioned, what kind of impact are you seeing, Eric, immediately to us if they were implemented this year?
So I'm not too, so honestly, have not been tracking their budget that closely. So I do not have that information. I'm not aware of the details of what they're looking at and the potential impact.
And remind us again, when we're looking at these revenue options, and if nothing's enacted, when are you anticipating that we would have to do a reduction in something if nothing changes?
Do you want to refer to that? We will backtrack to the one slide. So we do have a current balanced budget for 23 and 24, where we are anticipating to draw down on the reserves. And then it was kind of depend on where we finish the year in 2024, you know, how much reserves remains in the out years, but I hope that kind of gives you an idea.
Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that even though we'd be directing staff to bring both councilmatic options and voter approved options to us at the same time, I think the voter approved options would be dependent on whenever we'd be able to get it on a ballot. So we wouldn't be necessarily approving them at the same time, but having information at the same time, I think is important so that we can look at both what we can do right away and get moving right away councilmatically, and then looking at what we can put before the voters to make a decision on at whatever election date makes sense. The options would be February, April, and August, I think. But in terms of when special elections are, I could be mistaken about that.
We do have a running list of dates for, not just dates for elections, but also the deadlines for submitting a
Great,
ballot.
okay.
So we're working with the Department of Elections.
Okay, great. So yeah, I think it makes sense to have information for both brought back to us and then timeline for folks to, for us to have it before the voters.
I have another just clarifying question, Eric. So fiscal year 2024, is that starting July 1 or is that a calendar year?
No, our budget is based on the calendar year, January through December.
Any other questions or comments?
I have one. Yes.
Go ahead, Councilmember Garcia.
Thanks, Mayor. Thanks for the presentation. Again, you've made this presentation numerous times throughout the year, numerous times, so thank you. I think it's important. I will be supportive of this motion and specifically to have both presented. We are way behind schedule on this, and I support totally for us to get the information fast, so getting both is great. Because we just had a great presentation about our park system, our pros parks and everything we would love to have done to improve lighting, safety on the parks, event engagement, and none of that would be feasible without us taking action on this. And we're way behind on it, not due to you guys, just in general, we've been busy this year. So thank you so much. I would like to make one request for this presentation that we get in the coming time, and that is to include one slide, a general slide that is informational on how much we get from property taxes, from people's property taxes. I think the general public is not aware of how little the city gets from their property taxes when we have to share that with fire, with ambulances, with hospitals. So I think having just one informational sheet there would be tremendously important, just as well as having this. So that's the one ask.
Okay, thank you. So with that, we have a motion that is on the table. And that was proposed by Deputy Mayor Schilling, seconded by Councilmember Moore. So all those in favor, please raise your hand or say aye. Motion passes unanimously.